Welcome, comrades, to the art of cinema. I am Colonel T, Minister of Propaganda, and joining me as always is our glorious leader, General Secretary F.
Thank you, Colonel. Only through the unity of the party can the integration of our agriculture, industry, military, and the arts be achieved, and it is only through the integration of our agriculture, industry, military, and the arts that the enemy can be defeated and the national atrocitarian revolution be accomplished.
It is as you say, sir. May the unity of the party be preserved at all costs.
Oh, I'll make sure of it. For many of whom I have often told you, and now tell you even with tears, walk as enemies of the revolution. Their end is destruction. Their manifesto is capitalism, and they glory in their shame with their minds set on imperialism.
We're here to help them avoid such a fate, sir. And today on The Art of Cinema, we're starting a special feature. We're going to cover the top 10 films of the 2010s.
Excellent. So take note, citizens of the People's Republic of F. You are now required by law to consider these films to be your 10 favorite movies of the 2010s. And in this order. Be very careful, then, that you don't get any of these wrong when you're discussing film with your comrades. The secret police are always listening.
To start our review of the 10 best movies of the 2010s, at number 10 we have I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House. This movie is a ghost story, sir, and a meditation on death and the memory of those who've passed on. It's not what you'd expect from the usual ghost story, and it's the sort of movie that gets better with repeated viewings. I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House stars Ruth Wilson. She's a hospice nurse, and she's been hired to live with and care for Paula Prentice, an old woman with dementia. When Paula Prentice was young, she was a best-selling novelist. She wrote horror stories, so she was a Stephen King type. At the beginning of the film, then, Ruth Wilson moves into the beautiful old house in rural Massachusetts where Paula Prentice lives. It's just the two of them, and since Paula Prentice sleeps most of the time and is senile, mostly it's just Ruth Wilson by herself in a large old house out in the country.
Ruth Wilson is a proletarian worker, then, and Paula Prentice is a bourgeoisie property owner of the landed class. So Ruth Wilson does all the work, but Paula Prentice denies her access to the fruits of her own labor and enjoys all the benefits. Talk about your horror stories! Good grief, bourgeois private property is the final and most complete expression of the system of producing and appropriating products based on class antagonisms. But perhaps Ruth Wilson has read a copy of the General Secretary F manifesto. Maybe she has it in her to take up the revolution and seize the means of production from Paula Prentice.
We can only hope so, sir. Ruth Wilson, our proletarian nurse, is a high-strung, nervous, easily scared sort, so much so that she can't bring herself to read more than a few pages of one of Paula Prentice's horror novels before she has to stop. Ruth Wilson is alone with her thoughts in this large, empty, isolated old house, and from the start she can almost see, or almost hear, someone else in the house with her and the old woman. She's spooked by it. But Ruth Wilson gives us a voice-over narration of the story, and her narration describes the events we're seeing in the past tense. From the very start of the film, she narrates the story from some point in the future and describes herself as a ghost, even though we see her alive and well in the present. Ruth Wilson says, I did not know it at the time, but the house that stands at the end of Teacup Road in the town of Braintree, Massachusetts, was a house that holds a seat for the memory of a death, the staying place of a rotted ghost. From where I am now, I can be sure of only a very few things. The pretty thing you are looking at is me. Of this I am sure. 3 days ago I turned 28 years old. I will never be 29 years old. So the story seems to be a story in the present tense, combined with a past tense memory of these events by the ghost Ruth Wilson is about to become. She seems to be living the events of her life in the old house over and over again outside of time. In the narration, Ruth Wilson tells us that ghosts have stayed to look back for a glimpse at the very last moments of their lives. But the memories of their own deaths are faces on the wrong side of wet windows, smeared by rain, impossible to properly see. There is nothing that chains them to the places where their bodies have fallen. They are free to go, but still they confine themselves, held in place by their looking. For those who have stayed, their prison is their never seeing.
I see. So the ghost's prison is never seeing how she died, whereas prison for the citizen of the PRF is the Arctic labor camp, where we would purge her of any counter-revolutionary tendencies.
Right. There's a scene, for example, where Ruth Wilson calls a friend of hers on the phone and tells her how spooked she is in the old house. But as the conversation goes on, it starts to sound like Ruth Wilson isn't actually talking to anyone. What she's saying on her end of the call sounds more like someone talking to herself, imagining what she might say if she were on the phone with someone. Or it's as though the ghost of Ruth Wilson is only trying to remember the way she once talked to her friend. Paula Prentiss keeps referring to Ruth Wilson as Polly, and we learn that Polly is the main character from The Lady in the Walls, Paula Prentiss's best-selling horror novel. Later on in the film, we see a flashback to when the house was first built. A wealthy man built it in 1812 for Polly, his young bride, but then he killed her on their wedding day and hid the body in the walls. Polly's ghost has been communicating with Paula Prentiss, who told Polly's story in her novel, The Lady in the Walls. So Polly is the ghost in the old house with Ruth Wilson.
You know, early on, at the start of the revolution, throughout the PRF, our agricultural collectives found themselves short of labor. That's when I realized that the women of our society were a vast, untapped source of labor. So at my command, the PRF liberated its women and called upon them to join with the men on our agricultural labor front. Just think how I could have freed Ruth Wilson from being haunted in this old house, all by herself.
Yes, sir. If you'd been their glorious leader, you would have granted all these women a life of heroic service to the revolution.
Right. And, as an aside, I am her glorious leader. She just doesn't know it yet. So Polly wouldn't have been stuck in the house waiting for her husband to kill her, and then Paula Prentiss and Ruth Wilson wouldn't have been left there alone to be haunted by Polly's ghost. In the PRF, I would have freed them to work tirelessly, enacting the ideology of their glorious leader, General Secretary F.
You would have bound them to the party, sir, to build up our glorious nation at breakneck speed. At the end of the story, Ruth Wilson once again senses someone else in the house, so she goes looking. The ghost of Polly follows Ruth Wilson and finally shows itself to her. This scares Ruth Wilson so much she dies of a heart attack. Later, the property manager arrives at the house and finds both Ruth Wilson and Paula Prentiss dead inside. At some point in the future, after all this, a family moves into the house, and Ruth Wilson's ghost haunts them there. She tells us in her voiceover narration, "I have heard myself say that a house with a death in it can never again be bought or sold by the living. It can only be borrowed from its ghosts." And so it is. The house that stands at the end of Teacup Road near the town of Braintree, Massachusetts, you may borrow it from me. Because the memory of a death is a thing that stays, pressed deeply in place like type on paper, even after it has been covered up with nothing left to see. And still, I think I'll stay for one more look at her. This is how I let myself rot. The pretty thing you're looking at is me.
But it's not really the ghost of Polly that scares Ruth Wilson so much at the end of the film. The scene is metaphorical, I'd say, because deep down, Ruth Wilson knows that it's an honor to be alive or dead upon the road to revolution. So as she's having her heart attack, she's scared because she realizes that there's no more time left for her to overturn the culture of silence by introducing a counter-hegemonic view of capitalism. Ruth Wilson is terrified in her final moments, not because she finally sees the ghost of Polly, but because she let her whole life go by without educating the people in class consciousness or teaching the people to decodify their circumstances so as to understand how those circumstances produce oppression. The people must gain class consciousness to determine what their role is in transforming society into an atrocitarian utopia.
Certainly that's the meaning of the Ruth Wilson character, sir. But what about Paula Prentiss? The film ends without really exploring what her character teaches us about the revolution.
Well, Paula Prentiss thinks that she can depoliticize her horror novels. That's the problem. There's no such thing as art for art's sake. No such thing as art that stands above class struggle or is independent of it. Art must serve as part of the proletarian revolutionary cause. I think that's probably what the ghost of Polly was really upset with Paula Prentiss about, and it's why Polly kept haunting her, to make Paula Prentiss understand that her novels should have served as cogs in the wheels of the revolutionary machine.
So, I Am the Pretty Thing That Lives in the House is number 10 in our list of the top 10 films of the 2010s. It's an unusual, fascinating movie that you can interpret in different ways. It's more mysterious than it is scary, and the three characters, Ruth Wilson, Paula Prentice, and Polly, are related in mysterious ways. So I've returned to the film many times to get a better idea of it all. There's not a lot to say about the story, but there's a lot to the experience of it. This has been The Art of Cinema, with our glorious leader, General Secretary F. Let us maintain vigilance against the ever-looming threat of an American invasion. You are required to report any non-participation or dissent amongst your comrades. Don't forget to tune in to The Art of Cinema again next time to find out which film comes in at number 9 on the list in your next mandatory re-education session.